Good afternoon. My name is Patricia O'Reilly, and on behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you here to our webinar, Israel-Palestine Before and After October the 7th, What Changed? Our presenter is Father David Newhouse. A particular welcome today to our friends from Independent Jewish Voices and our many American participants. Thank you all for being with us. The presentation will be 90 minutes. This will include the presentation time plus the time for questions and answers. Please ensure your questions are in the Q&A box. They may be missed if they're in the chat box. A link to the recording of the presentation will be sent to registered participants within 72 hours. We begin with a land acknowledgement. Let us begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which many of us call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relations between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit, each in our own way, to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It's my pleasure to introduce Father David Newhouse. David is a member of the Society of Jesus. He teaches scripture at various institutions in Israel, Palestine. He completed a BA, MA, and PhD in political science at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He then completed pontifical degrees in theology and scripture in Paris and Rome. He is Emeritus Latin Patriarchal Vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel, and he's the coordinator of the Pastoral Among Migrants and Asylum Seekers in Israel. I met David years ago in Jerusalem when he taught at the Bat Kol Institute, where I was studying with Dr. Marina Fritz. Recently, I've worked with him in Jerusalem at the Notre Dame de Sion Center for Biblical Foundation. It is an honor to have him with us today. David, we have participants logged on from around the world: South Africa, Israel, Palestine, Belgium, India, and of course, Canada, and many participants from the United States. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Patricia. I'm very, very honored and happy to be with you as we share on a very difficult subject, very sensitive. I am in Jerusalem and feelings, emotions are running very high. Every word weighed. Are you for us? Are you against us? From every side. So what I'm going to do is I have prepared a PowerPoint, and we will be looking at the different slides on the PowerPoint as we work through my part, which is the first presentation. And then afterwards, I hope that there will be time for dialogue, conversation around questions that you can pose in the question and answer box and comments. I do want to say a word. Today has been a very, very significant day for the ongoing conflict that began on October the 7th. For today in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, a first day of a case brought by South Africa against the State of Israel, claiming, and the case was presented today, that Israel is engaged in genocide with genocidal intention. The proceedings will continue tomorrow when Israel presents its denial of that claim. When we first prepared this webinar, Patricia and I did not know that it would fall on this day, but I think it's significant that it does. And so let us now begin. I will open the PowerPoint and we can work our way through it. There must be. Sorry, for some reason it went to the... Okay, that's where it should have started. Sorry for that little technical problem. So, Israel-Palestine after 7th of October 2023, what changed? It's formulated a little different from the way it was on the poster, but the theme is the same. And as you will be able to tell as we work through this presentation, I am not necessarily saying that anything essential has changed. The issues are the same. But let's begin. I want to begin with this image, an image that came out of Gaza City just a few days ago, the 7th of January 2024, from a parish community in Gaza with which we, the Catholic community in the Holy Land, is deeply linked in these days. A parish community that has been living through the trauma, through the catastrophe that has been visited on their home in Gaza. The few Christians that remain are gathered in the parish, taking refuge there. There is also a Greek Orthodox church in Gaza, and both these communities have known catastrophe up close. A missile, Israeli missile, landed right next to the Greek Orthodox church, causing a wall to collapse, and 18 people, 17 of whom were Christians, died in the ensuing collapse. And then in the Catholic parish, an Israeli gunman opened fire on the courtyard of the parish, killing an elderly woman and her daughter. Of course, these victims are among the thousands and thousands, more than 23,000 known victims that have already died in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October. There have been other Christians who have been killed. The well-known organist of the Christian community, Greek Orthodox, played in the Latin community in the Baptist church, shot dead in the street, and a number of Christians who have died because they could not receive needed hospital care. So the Christian community is a little microcosm, but I wanted to show this picture of the first communion that was held there just a few days ago, because I think that many of us wept when we saw the children who are going through this together with so many children in Gaza, but a little flicker of life, a little light there in the midst of all the darkness. And then again, today marks the beginning of this process of Israel taken before the International Court of Justice in The Hague by South Africa. I'm not sure if Patricia did mention, but I'm born in South Africa. So again, I feel very implicated in what's going on today in The Hague, what will continue tomorrow. And here is the accusation brought against Israel by South Africa. Israel's actions are genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnical group. That is the wording in the 84-page report handed in to open the proceedings. They have been completed the first day, South Africa making its case. Tomorrow, Israel will respond, and then we will wait to see whether the International Court of Justice orders a stop to the war, or orders other acts that Israel must undertake in order to prevent the continuation of the catastrophe. Now, I'm sure you all know, so we don't need to go over this in great detail, but what are we talking about when we say, the 7th of October? What happened on that day? And of course, we woke up, especially those of us who are Israelis and Palestinians, we woke up to the catastrophe of a group of Palestinian militants breaking through the fence that seals off the Gaza Strip and entering into the south of Israel, committing great crimes, war crimes, massacring people, rapes. We are gathering evidence about the rapes, and very important for the ongoing trauma, the kidnapping of 240 Israelis that were taken into the Gaza Strip. That all happened on October the 7th, and that very day, the beginning of the hostilities that continue after 3 months, massive bombardment of the Gaza Strip, the loss of life being devastating, the destruction of property. 85% of the Palestinians in Gaza becoming refugees pushed to the south, and the divided world that we see around us, a divided world. Many of the strong nations, the United States, your own country in Canada, the European Union in its major part, standing firmly alongside Israel and Israel's right to self-defense, a very problematic term, as many of us who follow church discourse know. What does that exactly mean? The right to self-defense when we're talking about a heavily armed military power. And many people around the world, poorer countries, but also many people in the richer countries coming out onto the street to support the Palestinian people and the continuing catastrophe that is going on. I put there at the end because my assumption is, although it might be a wrong assumption, that many of those listening in, connected through the Jesuit network, might be Catholics, that just a few days before the 7th of October, a significant event happened for the local church when Pope Francis elevated our Archbishop, who is known as the Patriarch, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, to becoming a cardinal. And the cardinal's voice has been a very important voice as he tries to define what we as Catholics think and how we should react to this ongoing catastrophe. And of course, we won't get much into the actual church position, but I do want to say that many of us here feel that Pope Francis has been a voice of sanity from the first day, going on through all these weeks, already 3 months, maintaining a very simple message of stop the killing. War does not solve any problems. Terror cannot be responded to with terror. And already on October the 8th, the Pope stood up. The October the 8th was Sunday. So in his Sunday address to the faithful, he said the following words that I think echo through all these weeks and months. I am following apprehensively and sorrowfully what is happening in Israel, where the violence has exploded even more ferociously, causing hundreds of deaths and casualties. I express my closeness to the families and victims. I am praying for them and for all who are living hours of terror and anguish. May the attacks and weaponry cease. please. And let it be understood that terrorism and war do not lead to any resolutions, but only to the death and suffering of so many innocent people. War is a defeat. Every war is a defeat. Let us pray that there be peace in Israel and in Palestine. And again, personally, and I think we as a church here in the Holy Land, and many people all over the world, are very grateful for the clarity of the Pope's voice all through these months. On October the 10th, we had an important address from President Joseph Biden. And I think it was a very different kind of address. And of course, this is part of what we also are trying to deal with, the absolutely unconditional support of the United States for the Israeli government, for the Israeli establishment, which of course did not begin on 7th of October, but has been ongoing since 1948 and has always been incomprehensible. But of course, in the light of what's going on, is very, very difficult to understand. The president said, you know, there are moments in this life when the pure, unadulterated evil is unleashed on this world. The people of Israel lived through one such moment this weekend. The bloody hands of the terrorist organization Hamas, a group whose stated purpose for being is to kill Jews. This was an act of sheer evil. So in this moment, we must be crystal clear. We stand with Israel. We stand with Israel, and we will make sure Israel has what it needs to take care of its citizens, defend itself, and respond to this attack. And let there be no doubt, the United States has Israel's back. We will make sure the Jewish and democratic state of Israel can defend itself today, tomorrow, as we always have. It's as simple as that. And I would say that if this response might indeed be comprehensible a day or two after the terrible massacres of the 7th of October, the American position, the US position has not changed much, and with each passing day becomes more and more difficult to understand. So a very quick chronology. We all know this. We've been following the news. The missiles from Gaza, the attacks on southern Israel, this Palestinian initiation of the present round in the conflict, and then the beginning of Israeli bombardments of Gaza. And October 8th, Israel declares war. October 9th, on the northern border, Hezbollah initiates hostilities. And I'd like to point out that it is true that within Israel, hundreds of thousands of people have also been misplaced, well taken care of by the Israeli government, but had to leave their homes on the border with Gaza and on the northern border, and have become people moving around from place to place in this period of 3 months. Their 2 children traumatized by a complete stop in their routine. On October the 15th, and this is ongoing, but I signify it as massive after October 7th, the Israelis beginning a campaign of arrests in the West Bank, rounding up opposition to opponents to the occupation. And then what seemed like a glimmer of hope, October the 21st, 2 hostages, Israelis, but with American citizenship, were released, a mother and her daughter. There was a glimmer of hope that perhaps the hostilities would stop and people would be released from being hostage, people would be released from prison, and some kind of normality could be restored. On October the 23rd, 2 very elderly Israeli women hostages were released. October the 28th, the end of that glimmer of hope as Israel begins a ground invasion moving in with massive military force into the very, very densely populated Gaza Strip and beginning a program of destruction. Of course, the Israeli slogan is until victory. We will be victorious over Hamas. We will root out Hamas. But in the 3 months that have passed, it's become more and more difficult to understand what does that mean? And are the Israelis fighting some identifiable Hamas opposition? Or is Hamas now completely identifiable with the Palestinian people as a whole? On October the 31st, we have the first missiles shot from Yemen, from the Houthis, showing that this conflict can easily set the Middle East and perhaps even the world alight, as military activities come from Lebanon, from Yemen, and the threat of violence is absolutely clamoring all around us. And then again, a time of a glimmer of hope from November the 24th to December the 1st, a ceasefire, an agreement mediated by predominantly Egypt and other Arab countries, Qatar being very, very implicated in these negotiations, to have a ceasefire and have an exchange of those taken out of their lives. Israeli hostages were released, uniquely women and children, and also women, underage Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons released, and then that was extended to some other prisoners being released from Israeli prisons. But again, when that ceasefire ended, the little flicker of hope was again extinguished as the war continued without any mercy. Missiles from Gaza continued to fall on Israel, and the Israeli military campaign into the Gaza Strip, and basically the flattening of the Gaza Strip continued. On December the 15th, a terrible weekend, on December the 15th, a Friday, 3 Israeli hostages who somehow got out of their imprisonment, either released by their Palestinian kidnappers or having escaped, were killed by Israeli fire. And of course, that drove home the fact that the Israelis are firing on whoever is there, having killed now these 3 young men who were almost naked, holding a white flag and trying to get to the Israeli army. And then what we have today and tomorrow, the beginning of the process against Israel in the International Court of Justice, brought about by the process initiated by the South African government. I've put there, and again, it's terrifying, the casualties, those dead. We're not talking about those who have been massively wounded, who have lost everything, but already are today more than 23,000 Palestinians killed, with a very large number, around 7,000, missing, buried in the rubble as the missiles fall on residential areas, wiping out whole neighborhoods. And of course, yes, around 1,400 or more Israelis who have been killed, around 1,200 on that first day, and then the continuing toll of Israelis killed among the soldiers who have gone into the Gaza Strip. Let's remember that already we're dealing with something that goes beyond Gaza. We have the West Bank, which is at boiling point, sealed off by the Israelis, people not able to go to their workplaces inside Israel. But not only that, all the time raids, continual raids on the cities of the West Bank, clashes between the Israeli soldiers and the Palestinian resistance, many deaths, hundreds of deaths already on the West Bank, and thousands of people arrested, taken into Israeli prisons. And inside Israel, again, a traumatized Jewish population, many people not living in their homes, hundreds of thousands, around 200,000 people who have been had to leave their homes. Of course, on the border with Gaza, many of those homes destroyed, but also a Palestinian Arab population, citizens of Israel, under constant surveillance. It's important to remember that there are around 1.75 million Palestinian Arabs who are full citizens of Israel. I'm not including the Palestinian Arabs who live in East Jerusalem, who are generally not full citizens of Israel, but the Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel being surveyed with great suspicion. Are they going to be quiet? Are they going to be loyal citizens? Or are they in some way sympathetic with their sisters and brothers in Gaza and in the West Bank? And then, of course, as I already mentioned, problems on the northern border. Continuing clashes between Hezbollah forces that have tried to cross the border in a kind of imitation of the Hamas people who came across from Gaza, but also the sending of missiles from Hezbollah into Israel and the continual raiding of Lebanese and Syrian airspace with Israeli planes that are bombing certain, what Israel would call strategic points in Lebanon and Syria, with the growing death toll in both those countries. And then, again, broader than that, for example, the Houthis in Yemen also showing their solidarity with Gaza by firing missiles, trying to take over ships. We have a very, very, very violent and volatile situation. And then beyond, a world that is watching. You see the images here of Netanyahu and Biden, of Mohammed bin Salman and Erdogan, the president of Turkey, Ismail Haniyeh, the foreign leader of Hamas, with the president of Iran, and the Pope meeting with families of hostages, as he also met with families of people in Gaza who have been killed. So a very polarized world. Again, it's frightening to see how this could spill over into more and more violence. The protests and civil unrest in many of the big cities, including in the cities that probably you live in the United States, in Canada, but in Europe, a real sense of outrage at what is going on. And then no small protest also coming from the Jewish community that feels that it must stand with Israel in this moment of trial. The role of Iran and those countries that have turned Iran into a major enemy of our time. Again, I'm not pronouncing here whether Iran is dangerous to the world or not dangerous to the world, but the polarization between Iran and its allies and the front against it is another point of great danger for the welfare of our planet. I put here also Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, because let us remember that at least a part of the motivation for the total despair of Palestinians, particularly those in Gaza, was watching how countries like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf principalities were drawing closer and closer to Israel. And that is undoubtedly one of the great provocations to the Palestinians, who were pushed more and more into the margins, ignored as this cozying up based upon economic interests, based upon Israel providing a lot of aid to the control of citizens in these countries, and of course the United States administration promoting what is known as the Abraham Accords and a future normalization with Saudi Arabia, which all meant that Palestinians had to disappear from the stage of history. They were an obstacle to the vision of a peaceful Middle East. And then, of course, the roles of countries like Egypt and Turkey getting involved, being sometimes a bridge, but also, of course, facing their own populations enraged by the aggression against the Palestinian people. And the church in all this, again, that would be the subject of another webinar, are the attempt of the church, both from the Holy See and from the local church in Israel, Palestine, to find words to speak about what is happening, words that construct some kind of dialogue, some kind of hope for a future that could be based upon these two peoples, the Israeli people and the Palestinian people, living together in this land. So, back to the question, has anything changed since October the 7th? And of course, we have two visions. Everything changed because everything was going so well. We were almost normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. We had signed these wonderful agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco. Sudan was about to come on board. We, of course, had already diplomatic relations with Egypt and Jordan, and negotiations was going, perhaps not so well, but they were going with Lebanon. An Israeli version. Everything changed. Something terrible happened on October the 7th that changed the stage of the world. And then, of course, on the Palestinian side, saying, no, nothing has changed. We have been marginalized, pushed more and more and more out of history by Israeli aggression that began in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. So again, this very question is at the heart of a polemic, at the heart of a war of presenting narratives between an Israeli leadership. You see on the one side, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Minister of Defense, the member of the War Cabinet. On the other side, the Hamas leadership, local Yahya Sinwar, and then the international representatives of Hamas. One side saying everything has changed. We were heading for such a wonderful future. And the other side saying nothing has changed, because in that wonderful future, based upon the horrific present that we're in, the Palestinian people had not been heard. Their cry since 1948 for justice has gone absolutely unheard by Israel, and I would add by the international community. So when did it begin? When did this violence begin? Again, a central question. Did it begin on October the 7th? Certainly an eruption of violence like we've never seen. But many Palestinians would say it is a continuity of cycles of violence that have begun a very long time ago. And so when will it end? Well, that will depend very, very much on what are we talking about. The Israeli claim it will end when we are victorious. We will be victorious. Signs that you see all over in Israel. When you open your bank application, when you travel along the highways, when you get onto a public bus, we will be victorious. And what does that exactly mean? Well, nobody seems to be able to really say what that means. Or the Palestinians who say, when will it end? And that is a question that can only be answered by delving back into history. I would add that it seems we are in a moment of clarity. We have never perhaps seen so clearly what is at stake. We have never seen so clearly the mutual hatred of one group for the other and the unleashing of the most terrible violence. Let's now go backwards and notice that since 2008, we have had 5 military campaigns of Israel on the Gaza Strip. The present one is called Iron Sword. It followed 2021, Guardian of the Walls, again, a very violent campaign. 2014, Protective Edge. 2012, Pillar of Defense. 2008, CAST-led campaigns, military campaigns, led by Israel into the Gaza Strip to respond to the threat that Israel perceives coming from the Gaza Strip as groups in the Gaza Strip rain down missiles on Israel. Again, it seems that these campaigns are Israel in an act of self-defense. But each time the destruction visited on the Gaza Strip, the price paid by the people of Gaza was unimaginable and absolutely not comparable to the rather primitive missiles that indeed constituted a threat to Israel that were rained down from the Gaza Strip. Now, the first campaign, as we saw, was in 2008. Just before that, Israel had begun a blockade on the Gaza Strip, sealing it off from the world. And Israel would say, again, this was an act of self-defense, the hostility coming out of the Gaza Strip, represented by an organization called Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement. They needed, according to what Israel felt, to completely isolate the Gaza Strip. Many have suggested that this was not only an act of defense, but also an attempt to keep Gaza in some kind of status quo that could be controlled, impoverished, just surviving, so that the Gaza Strip, which is an overpopulated area, we'll soon see why it is so overpopulated, could never constitute any kind of threat to the state of Israel. But what had happened just before was an Israeli unilateral disengagement. Of course, for years, we'll see that in a moment, there had been negotiations sponsored by the United States between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the international community had hoped that these negotiations would lead to a two-state solution, meaning a state of Israel within the territories that Israel had been founded on. The State of Israel proclaimed in May 1948, engaged immediately in a big war that went on until January 1949, and in those boundaries secured by that war, the State of Israel would continue to exist in security, but that the Palestinians finally, after all the years of waiting, and again since 1948, would have a state made up by territories occupied by Israel after the 1967 war. What Israel did in 2005, and again it was provoked by an ongoing, seething unrest in these occupied territories, was it unilaterally disengaged from Gaza. This was not based upon negotiations with the Palestinians. It was the decision, and Israel had trouble with its own citizens putting into practice this decision. You see in the picture a group of Israelis some of them are wearing orange, a sign of identification with Israelis who lived in the Gaza Strip, had set up their homes in the Gaza Strip after 1967, what the international community calls settlements, and were now told to get out because the Gaza Strip was going to be sealed off and handed over to the Palestinian Authority. So the disengagement, again done with no real negotiation with the Palestinian Authority, was supposedly an act to show that Israel was going to abide by the decision to create a Palestinian state. But of course, the violence was that the Gaza Strip was completely separated from the rest of what was supposed to become the Palestinian state in the West Bank, which continued under Israeli control. And so when the Israelis pulled out, which was an act that shocked many Palestinians who fully realized that Gaza cannot exist by itself, what was being done, in fact, was sealing off a very overpopulated area as a kind of ghetto. And when Hamas contested the elections and won, and the Palestinian Authority had to cede control of Gaza to the Hamas authorities, Israel cut off the Gaza Strip. And so we had the beginning of an incredible humanitarian disaster in a strip of land overpopulated and unable to control any of its borders to bring in what was necessary to make sure that people in the Gaza Strip could live some kind of reasonable life. Again, what had happened in the time preceding the Israeli decision to pull out of Gaza was a second uprising against Israeli occupation, an uprising that began at the end of September 2000. It was provoked by the Israeli politician Ariel Sharon going up in a very provocative way into the Haram al-Sharif, the very sacred place of the two mosques, the Dome of the Rock, and even more importantly, the Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, striding in to say, this is also ours. This is the Temple Mount. And of course, as many of you will know, there are groups of Israelis who lay claim to that area. And so years of violence broke out, beginning in 2000 in September. You see the image there that became almost iconic of the second Intifada. A young boy hiding behind his father. He was shot dead. It became a cause célèbre. He was shot dead in a clash between Israel and the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, Mohammed al-Dura. And then again, the acts of violence also from the Palestinian side of buses being blown up, a phenomenon that had begun shortly before and continued. And so again, excessive violence with always the hope on the Palestinian side that somehow this history would lead to the hearing of the call for a Palestinian state. Well, we thought that that call had been heard in the mid-1990s. That historic picture of the Israeli leadership gathered with the Palestinian leadership on the lawn of the White House, signing the 1993 Accords. Many of us believed that this would lead to an independent state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel. This was a hope that was very quickly smashed by continuing violence and by the Israeli refusal to really give up the territories that had been occupied in 1967. That process had been provoked by the first Intifada. From 1987, Palestinians, a local leadership had emerged, and many, many young people whose only reality was one of occupation took to the streets. Some of it, at least in the beginning, was non-violent, but they were met with great repression from the Israeli army. And many lost their lives from the very first days in December, 6th of December in the Gaza Strip, 9th of December in the West Bank. The 15th of December, it spread to Jerusalem. And those were, again, very difficult years that eventually led to a certain hearing of the Palestinian cry. But again, it never brought any fruit, not the fruit that the Palestinians were waiting for. Let us remember again what we've already said, and we can move through this very quickly, that the state of Israel within the borders that had been internationally recognized in 1947, 1948, 49, had occupied huge territories in the 1967 war, and Gaza had become a part of those territories under Israeli occupation, together with the West Bank, of course, including East Jerusalem. Now, focusing in again on Gaza, the great change in Gaza after 1948, that first Israeli war with its Arab neighbors, Again, the Palestinians being an integral part of the war, but very much ignored. After 1948, the Egyptians set up in Gaza what they called the All-Palestine Government. But what is so important to realize here is that the population of Gaza before the war was about 80,000 people. Some of them are, before the war, still being a few Jews left in Gaza. But after the war, Gaza found itself with a population of refugees, 120,000. 60% of the population of Gaza after 1948 were refugees. It's now up to 70%. And of course, the population has increased. Today, we have 2.3 million people living in this small strip of land. Gaza was occupied the first time in 1956, 1957. The Israelis withdrew. And in 1959, the Egyptians, who had occupied Gaza, in fact, since 1948-49, imposed full Egyptian administration. It was from the Egyptians that Gaza was conquered in the 1967 war. Again, we said, when did everything start? In 1917, there is a certain starting point. There were 600,000 Arabs in this strip of land known as Palestine, 60,000 Jews, including a small Jewish community in Gaza. The ruling authority were the Ottoman Turks, and in marched the British. You see there General Allenby marching into the old city, and the British government make a declaration of intention to set up a Jewish homeland in Palestine. You see there the wording, His Majesty's government, King George V, view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. There were Jews there. Many of them might have dreamed of a national home, but this is the first international recognition of an entity that would become Jewish. Again, I think that here begins a history that would lead to decades of violence, and we are in the midst of it still. Notice, though, that the British did add something that was never respected, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Again, something violent there. Now, the indigenous communities of Palestine are being defined as Jewish and non-Jewish, rather than Jews and Palestinians living in a territory which perhaps they must learn to share, and that this would not also in any way damage the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. What we have, and I think that we need to recognize this, is that there are two national movements in conflict. There is a Jewish national movement that sees the Jewish presence in Palestine as a return to an ancient homeland. And that is an integral part of how Jews, many, not all, most absolutely, but many Jews define themselves today, as somehow seeing in the land that was called Palestine an ancient homeland. Of course, the events of the 20th century convinced many Jews that they needed a homeland because of the horrific anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews, especially in Europe. And alongside the development of this new nationalist movement emerging from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century was born a Palestinian national movement that was claiming its homeland in Palestine. And we see here the leaderships that confronted one another. Of course, we are in a particularly toxic period in this clash between two national movements. And part of that toxic nature is when we mix nationalism and religion, not just making a claim in the name of the nation, but attributing that claim to the will of God. A reading of sacred scriptures, whether it's the Bible, the Jewish Tanakh, or the Quran, and making absolute claims for the one people that should have the land that, in this religious language, is destined for it by God. The nationalist rhetoric has, of course, increased. And I think that today we commonly hear from both sides the definition of the other as evil. The Israelis' repeated claim that Hamas are Nazis or equivalent to the foes of the Jewish people all through the ages, whose only aim is to kill Jews. On the other side, I would insist to point out that the Palestinians see the Jews as foreign invaders, colonialists who have come from somewhere else with no real claim to even a right to live in the land. And of course, here there is much work to be done so that these two people can recognize one another. That leads into, of course, looking at the other and say, you don't belong here. This is not where you should be. And we've seen the revealing of plans by the certain elements in the Israeli establishment to move the entire population of Gaza out of Gaza in the hope that Egypt will, for all kinds of reasons, open its borders and all or most of the Palestinians from Gaza can be pushed into Egypt. This, for the Palestinians, is an ongoing trauma, as so many Palestinians were already pushed out in 1948. So they don't belong here. Jewish Israelis saying to Palestinian Arabs, you don't belong here. Palestinian Arabs saying to Jewish Israelis, you don't belong here. And then, of course, the question of violence. Who started? And of course, it's always they started. And the violence will continue until victory. And then finally, there is no other way. I think many Israelis, many Palestinians feel today, after 76 years of a very open conflict, but I'd go even back to 1917, although then there were many more possibilities open to us, the feeling that this war will never end. But looking at prospects, at least in discourse, well, I think that we can outline three, and maybe none of them will be the future. That there will be one ethnic state, in other words, expelling the other. Very much part of the discourse today. It's become more and more central in political discourse on both sides of the divide. We need to get rid of the other. And then an international community and many rational people on both sides who say, no, we can make a compromise, 2 states for 2 peoples. But let's face it, that has become a very, very tired slogan. It was proposed by the international community through the United Nations in 1947. And after 76 years, we still see that there are not 2 states for 2 peoples, but 1 state for a Jewish Israeli people, and what for the Palestinian Arab people. And then there are those who propose, if we are to get to a situation where we can talk to one another, we can understand one another, we can start saying, no, you also belong here. Perhaps we can reach something that sounds absolutely idyllic today, and that is 1 state, a democratic state, where Jews and Palestinians live side by side, enjoying neighborly relations. That is a dream. And I think many of us who live as Christians in this country really do pray for that, because the 2-state solution today sounds like just a continuation of 2 closed-off communities, suspicious of each other and continuing with a violent intent that the other should not exist. Briefly, as I end, we look at the population today of Israel and Palestine and notice that at this point in history, we've reached a moment where perhaps this is an opening, for there are 7 million Jews, just over 7 million Jews in the state of Israel. And of course, that includes those Jews who have decided to build their homes inside of the Palestinian territories. And within the same area, Israel-Palestine, we have 7 million Palestinians, okay? 5.4 million in Palestine, 2 million living inside the state of Israel. I do point out that the Palestinian Arabs of East Jerusalem are counted in both statistics because Israel has illegally annexed East Jerusalem. And so these people in East Jerusalem are counted both in the Israeli statistics and the Palestinian statistics. 7 million, 14 million people between the river and the sea. And very limited creativity to think how we are going to live together. So I end with a song. There must be another way. And the song is sung by an a Jewish Israeli singer, well known, Noam Nini, and a Palestinian Arab singer, well known, Mira Awad. Yes, sometimes from our politicians, or very often, not to say always, we receive very little opening of the horizons from our politicians. But thank God, in popular culture, we can find those who can open that horizon so that we can at least imagine something very different from what we have today.
There must be another way. עיניי אחות, כל מה שליבי מבקש אומרות. עברנו עד כה דרך ארוכה, דרך כה קשה, יד ביד והדמעות זולגות זורמות לשווא. אנחנו מחכות רק ליום שיבוא אחרי. There must be another way. There must be another way. عينك بتقول رح يجي يوم كل الخوف يزول. بعينك إصرار إنه عنا خيار نكمل هالمسار مهما طال لأنه ما في عنوان وحيد للأحزان بنادي للمدى للسما العنيدة. There must be another way. There must be another way. There must be another way. דרך ארוכה נעבור, דרך כה קשה, יחד אל האור, עינקי בתקול, כל החוף יזול. And when I cry for both of us. My pain has no name. And when I cry to the merciless sky and say, there must be another way. והדמעות זולגות זורמות לשווא כאב ללא שם. אנחנו מחכות רק ליום שיבוא אחרי. There must be another way. There must be another way. There must be another way.
David, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and we have some very interesting questions that have come in. Let me just find The first question, there's also another one similar, so I'll read both of them. Pope Francis has used very strong language to condemn what is happening in Gaza. Why is the response of local churches throughout the world and in the Christian churches so muted? Where are the calls from the Christian churches in the Holy Land to their sister churches around the world to organize, to march, to demand an end to the carnage? Why are the churches in Israel not marching out in the streets? And a similar question. Very looking forward to another webinar focused on the USA Catholic Church's history of silence and continuing silence on Palestine and Israel.
So I think that this is an excellent question, but I would say at the very heart of the churches is the very divide that we mentioned with regard to the pro-Israeli camp and the pro-Palestinian camp. In other words, if you looked at churches in places like, for example, South Africa, that has been so much in the news, the South African Catholic bishops brought out a very, very strong statement in reaction to a very insightful video of the chief rabbi of South Africa. So the voices are loud and clear. But when you look in countries where there is a government that is not leading the way in that kind of prophetic talk, then the voices of the churches are very muted. Now, there are three topics that are really decisive for us as Christians to speak out. And I'm just going to mention them again. We could talk at greater length at some other time. But point number one, how do we read the Bible? This is a very, very sensitive issue. The Bible has been used in the last 100 years by so many Christians to give a kind of affirmation to Zionism and the Jewish claim on the land. And I think that the development of hermeneutics that open up to understanding the Bible as good news for everyone, good news for Jews, good news for Palestinians, is something that we need to work on a lot. So that's point number one. Point number two, our history with the Jewish people is a traumatic history. I think that many Christians feel that the Jews have suffered so much at the hands of the Christian world as the hands of Christians in the world that they now need to stand alongside the Jewish people. And by the way, that is a very legitimate way of thinking. What I think is needed now is to separate between the Jewish people and the state of Israel and its policies. So I'm not suggesting we break off this revolutionary friendship with Jews in our modern world, but that we really do separate the Jewish people and our relations with them, relations that hopefully will get deeper and deeper, a friendship that will get stronger and stronger, and separate that from the whole issue of the state of Israel and its politics and policies and attitude towards the Palestinians. And the third subject, which is also a very, very difficult subject, is our attitude towards Muslims and the perception that Palestinians are Muslims and we don't like Muslims. And again, this is rooted in centuries of teaching that go back before the Crusades and then reached some kind of formulation in the Crusades. And we need to really look at that again and say, what is our attitude towards Muslims? Again, these are topics that were treated at the Second Vatican Council, but so many Christians, okay, Protestants and Catholics and all kinds of Christians really need to examine Bible, Jews, and Muslims in order to reach a much greater clarity, in order to stand alongside those who are suffering and support their call for justice.
Again, I'll put two questions together. Does Hamas's charter call for annihilation of Israel? And did rapes occur on October 7th by Hamas? But my main question is, why are the U.S. bishops not educating our parishioners about Palestine, where the living stones of faith have lived under occupation and annexation for decades?
Okay, so I'm not sure, Patricia, why you put those two.
Okay, I'll tell you what I'm putting together. Does Hamas
Yeah.
call for annihilation of Israel? And the next question, is Israel policy to commit genocide to drive Palestinians from their land?
Okay. So again, we are dealing with things that are very sensitive, and I'll try to be clear in a very short space of time. Hamas has, as part of its charter, as part of its discourse, radical language about absolutely not recognizing the state of Israel, yes, wanting the destruction of the state of Israel, and sometimes even very difficult language about Jews in general, that they are legitimate targets for attack wherever they are to be found. So there is very definitely a strain within Palestinian religious nationalism that is extremely problematic and that needs to be rejected in our awareness that it's there. Parallel to that, there are strains in Zionism that for a long, long time were in the margins, but that are now represented within the Israeli government. Our Minister of Police, for example, whose language about Palestinians mirrors the language used by Hamas. So again, I think that we need to recognize that in this clash between two national movements, the throwing in of religion, and it doesn't always need religion to be radicalized, has led to a radical refusal of the other. Now, that is not the genetic makeup of who Palestinians are or the genetic makeup of who Israelis are. This is the product of decades of a political leadership, and here I would put the greater onus on the political leadership of Israel because it's empowered. The Palestinians have never been empowered in a state of their own, but the onus is on our political leaders who have led us to a land in which there are no horizons. The only thing in front of us is a wall, and it's a wall of enmity and hatred. And so I don't think that we need to be so absolutely surprised by the brutality of what was witnessed on the 7th of October. It is horrific and cannot be in any way justified. And your question was, were there rapes? I don't have any reason to doubt that there were rapes. I think that we need to, of course, go through a process of collecting evidence and examining from a judicial point of view what were the crimes committed. But it was an explosion of rage, illegitimate, unjustified, but not incoherent. People in Gaza have been locked in a ghetto, okay? They have been facing incredible violence for decades. So the fact that people come out of there with that amount of rage is not strange. But I would say also on the Israeli side, the emergence of these voices that completely illegitimate the existence of the Palestinian people in terms that are absolutely racist is also a product of a leadership that has never embraced fully the existence of the other in order to engage with the other and search ways of going beyond this decades-long conflict.
I'm surprised to hear that you characterize this violence as religious, when I'm sure that you are aware of the opposition by a significant part of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish population, the Satmar Hasidic sect, to the existence of a Jewish state until its founding by God via the still-awaited Messiah. Can you clarify?
Yes, so thank you for the opportunity to clarify, because if I defined the violence as religious, I went against my own beliefs and principles. The violence is not religious. The violence is coming out of the clash between two national movements. What I tried to say, and what I will now say with greater clarity, is that when religion is thrown in other words, when religion is manipulated by nationalism to become a kind of divine sanction for what the national movement wants, that nationalism becomes even more toxic. That's what I meant to say. Please, that is what I mean. Now, it is true that within the Jewish community, there have always been and still are voices, and I would call them prophetic voices, who see how the religious tradition is impoverished by becoming so tied up with a national movement that the religion can no longer be a prophetic voice of critique. So yes, we can mention the Satmar movement. It's very marginal, very, very marginal. It's a small group of Jews. I would prefer to also mention the Jews who are seeing clearly. And by the way, these Jews saw clearly already in 1948. I mentioned two of them who are well known, much more than the Satmar. Martin Buber, who was a Zionist, and during the 1948 war woke up to the real danger to the Jewish soul that was emerging from the 1948 war. And the other, who was also a Zionist in her early days, but she too woke up exactly at that period, 1948 through the 50s and 60s, Hannah Arendt, prophetic Jewish voices who said, we need to be exceptionally careful with the dynamite that we are playing with. And they were prophetic voices because Israel today is represented by people who claim that they are speaking in the name of all Jews. But today it's very important that these movements emerge that say, not in my name. Okay, so again, no, it's not religious, but it's nationalism exploiting religion in order to make its case even more sealed and firm. Again, when I say, it's not only I hate you and I want you out of my land, but that's what God wants, it's really at its most toxic.
If countries around the world and Canada, which announced they would be taking 1,000 Palestinian refugees from Gaza, are they supporting what Zionists want from river to the sea?
Well, to some extent, yes. It's a very difficult situation when people really want a better future for their children and they want to get out of the hellhole that they have lived in for decades and not seen any possibility of some kind of light on the horizon. So, governments offering to take in Palestinians and Palestinians responding to that offer, I'm not going to condemn them. By the way, many Israelis also want a better life for their children. And so, although the Israeli authorities do not publicize this, we have huge communities of Israelis. I'm not talking about Jews, but Jewish Israelis living in North America. Some of them have made the decision to move because they want a better life. By the way, it's very interesting. I mentioned this just in passing that since the 7th of October, the request by Jews for European passports has shot up incredibly. Okay, so Jews who came originally from Europe, their ancestors, are now seeking to have that passport that guarantees them some kind of escape route if that need be. Again, we are living in a time when that mutual rejection has exploded into such incredible violence that it's very difficult to see into a beyond.
Does this siege have anything to do with following the money? The Gaza has offshore oil. There are plans for the Ben Gurion Canal to challenge the Suez Canal and the prime beachfront property throughout the coast of Gaza.
So I'm sure that some people think about that a lot. Okay, it's not. There are calls to, of course, expel Palestinians at least from the northern part of Gaza and lay down again settlements there to make make it again part of Israel. So I'm sure that there are people who think about that, but it is not a predominant part of the discourse right now. Are those kind of dreams of economically exploiting Gaza?
What can South Africa's dismantling of apartheid model for Palestine and Israel? Or are they apples and oranges?
No, they are not apples and oranges at all. I'm not saying that they are both apples or both oranges. There are differences and they need to be looked at closely. But there is something very, very important to say about what South Africa can represent for Israel-Palestine, and that is the creativity of the most prominent leaders of the South African resistance to formulating a vision of South Africa that was what South Africans call a rainbow nation. Because it would have been understandable, to be perfectly honest, and there are black leaders who spoke like that. They wanted vengeance. They wanted the white people to pay for those decades of repression and wiping out of the rights of the black people in South Africa. But those that predominated, okay, and of course in a way iconically represented by Nelson Mandela, was that we need to find a language that can say the new South Africa, and it's a new language. It's a language in which we have now a common society, a common horizon that we're moving towards. It hasn't all been easy sailing, but I have spent the last few months living in South Africa, not having lived there since the end of the 1970s, and it blew me away that the interaction of South Africans as South Africans is real. There's something very, it doesn't mean to say all the racism has disappeared, but at least the institutions of the state and the manifest social cohesion is mind-blowing for someone who knew South Africa in the late 1970s. And this is where it can really be a model for us in Israel-Palestine. Israel-Palestine is, of course, moving into a situation where people coming there and seeing the way Palestinians are treated, both inside Israel and in the territories occupied after 1967, and saying this is also a crime of apartheid. Okay, that there is an ethnocentric nature to the regime imposing a Jewish national state that so disprivileges or underprivileges the other people living there that we've moved into a time of apartheid. So I think we have much to learn, and a very fruitful dialogue can be held between South Africa and Israel if there's a willingness to listen and to learn. That's why I think it was so significant today that it was South Africa that took Israel to the International Court of Justice and not another country.
What parallels do you see between the situation in Gaza and the history of Northern Ireland? Your last slide, which showed the very evenly balanced population, was interesting because growing up in Northern Ireland, we often said that peace would come when the Catholics, nationalists, outbred the Protestants, unionists. Obviously, there are many differences in the political power of the Palestinian population and the will of the Israeli government, and the fact that Palestine is not an integrated territory. But do you see hope for the Israel-Palestinian future in what has happened in Northern Ireland since the Good Friday Accord, which was contemporaneous with the agreement between Israel and the PLO?
So again, I'm not an expert in Northern Ireland, and I know very little about Northern Ireland, but I do want to say, yes, we do derive hope, because when a conflict is ongoing and it seems so rooted in the total being of those participating in the conflict, that is like the conflict we're in. And when you see that a certain point is reached, when there is a change, when there is an opening, when there is that willingness to enter into an authentic, which we've never had in the Israel-Palestine situation, an authentic construction together of society, it certainly gives me hope. At this present moment, I must say that there are only two things that give me hope. One is, I believe in God. I pray every day for people in our situation who don't believe in God, because I think, how on earth can they even imagine a tomorrow? Okay, somehow my belief in God says God is the master of history. She seems to be a little deaf right now, seems to be not listening to us. I can shout my rage at God, but the fact that I really do believe that God is the master of history, or the mistress of history, means that, yes, it will come. It has to come. It cannot go on forever. And that is strengthened by looking at conflict situations like South Africa, like Northern Ireland, and saying, they also thought it would never come. In my family, we used to argue all the time through the 1980s, where is it going to end first? And I always said, it's going to end by you. And they said, it's going to end by you. We have no light on the horizon here. And that's what I said to them. And I won the bet. But the most important is, yes, we must not believe that there is no other way. We must not believe that nothing can change. And we must furthermore be instrumental in speaking a language that opens up the possibility of change.
I'll read two questions that are similar. Claims of anti-Semitism have been weaponized against any and all criticism of Israel's government and its actions in Gaza. What advice do you have for how to speak out about the situation without giving credence to the notion that any speech criticizing Israel's actions is necessarily pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic? And the next question, it is tempting to take a side or have a hot take on this conflict. So many people I know have an opinion which ends up in demonizing the other side. As Christians, should we think and say, how do we not sound either anti-Semitic or prejudiced against Palestinians and the Arab world in general?
So I'll start with the second question, which I think is an easier one to answer, or at least a shorter one. And that is, we have to take a side. We have to take a side for truth, for justice, for values. Okay, I think that we cannot sit on the fence and make sure that we're not saying anything for or against anyone. We have to take a side. But now we come to the first question, which is the criticism about anything you say might be anti-Semitic. And I want to say two things. First of all, anti-Semitism is real. It's out there. I've experienced it myself. I would not want to say that anti-Semitism has been created by the Israeli government as a way to silence critics. No, it's real and it's out there. But on the other side, don't believe that any criticism you make, which is not at all anti-Semitic, won't be defined by the Israeli establishment and its supporters as anti-Semitic. And that's the very important path that we need to forge out. And that is to make sure that we use language that is responsible, that we talk about the Israeli government, the Israeli army, what they are doing, and don't, for example, talk about the Jews. Okay, that is horrendous. In my time in South Africa, there was a lot of talk about boycotting Israeli goods. Okay, which I think might be a strategy that needs to be considered. Again, looking at the history of South Africa, that campaign was instrumental in changing South Africa. But I was horrified one day to wake up and realize that people, and I think out of ignorance, I don't think it was anti-Semitic, but it was totally ignorant, suddenly said, oh, and we should boycott this Jewish business and that Jewish business in South Africa. So again, I think we must be very careful. Anti-Semitism is real. The use of anti-Semitism to silence critics is real. So we must be very, very sure that we're not being anti-Semitic and very clear about being in solidarity with Palestinians who have suffered for all these decades and partially been silenced because of how guilty we feel as Christians for the way that we treated Jews. So again, it's all kind of intertwined, but I think with a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of knowledge, we can trace out a path in which we can be active agents for change, particularly in the way that we speak about what is going on in Israel-Palestine today.
There have been some questions about the song that you played. There is a link in the chat if anyone would like to get that link to the song. And also there's a link in the chat to an interview that David did with America Magazine just recently. So you can get that link to if you would like to read his interview. Do you still stand by your statement, the first step to peace in the Holy Land is to end the occupation?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the occupation, and again, you might ask me, what is the occupation? Okay. I think that we need to end the occupation. And that means making space, and a large space, to be in this land together with Palestinian Arabs, who are the indigenous people of the land, which is not to say that Jews do not have the right to see themselves as indigenous people. I mean, here again, these two national movements are making more and more absolutist claims to the land. And the only way to move forward is to make space for the other. Again, how exactly do we make space for the other? Well, that can take the different forms that I laid out and even use our creativity to go beyond those forms. Is it going to be two states? I'm now suspicious of two states. I think that two states might mean a very, very wealthy, militarized, and powerful Israeli state next to some kind of pathetic Palestinian state that cannot take care of its own people. And so perhaps we need to move beyond. I don't know. There are more and more Palestinians and some Israelis who are starting to consider how could we live in one state together. So I think, again, we need to apply ourselves through our mastery of language and be creative in order to propose a reality that is very different from the one that we have perpetuated for 76 years.
A final question, although we have lots more if we have more time. As we see all this, what personal decisions can we take to help promote this beautiful mindset of peace you talk about? And another question similar, what can we as US citizens or all citizens do to help advocate for peace in Palestine?
So I think that we need to speak out, but we need to speak out carefully choosing our words so that what we say are words that really promote justice. And, you repeated a number of times, peace. There can be no peace without justice. There can be no peace. This was the illusion of the process that was stimulated by the United States administration from Trump through Biden of let's sign peace agreements between Israel and Arab countries that had never been at war with Israel, making the whole concept of peace a total mockery. If there is to be peace, there needs to be justice. Justice is the foundation upon which peace can be constructed. Of course, the problem is absolute justice, okay, will mean wiping out a part of reality. And so our demand for justice needs to take into account what Palestine-Israel looks like today. But again, I think that we can have a very important role by speaking out with carefully chosen words so that our voices are heard wherever we are, whether it's in the United States. And of course, that's a very important place for this speaking out to happen. And we rejoice when we see the huge demonstrations that have taken place in solidarity with the Palestinian cry for justice. And I would say that what has been particularly moving is the Jewish participation in those huge protests. And wherever we are, particularly in the world that has money and influence and has strong relations with Israel, make your voices heard, saying that we cannot go on not listening to the cry of the Palestinian people for justice, for survival, in this horrific, catastrophic, ongoing war.
Thank you. David, thank you for your time today, your scholarship, your passion, your balanced presentation on the ongoing tragic siege of Gaza and the West Bank. You've given us a solid foundation about the current situation in Palestine. Our hearts are broken, and we join you in prayer that the siege will end and justice will reign. Thanks also to David Mann and our translators, Michelle and Giselle, for ensuring that our French language translation was working. And to all our participants, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you again. Later this month, we will have a presentation by Dr. Murray Watson on his new book, Restoring the Gospel's Jewish Voice. So thank you for being here. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you all.